I heard someone singing near our campsite, but none of us were missing yet. I was 27 when this happened, and I need to explain a few things first, because if I start with the singing, it sounds fake immediately. At the time, I was still saying yes to things I probably should have stopped doing in college. Weekend trips, last-minute plans, sleeping badly, pretending I was more outdoorsy than I actually was. I worked from home doing claims processing for an insurance company, and by spring that year, I felt like I was becoming part of my apartment. Same chair, same screen, same microwave lunches, same neighbors fighting through thin walls. So when my friend Tyler asked if I wanted to join him, his girlfriend Marin, and another couple on a camping trip in late April, I said yes before he even finished telling me where it was. I wasn't close with everybody going. Tyler and I had known each other since high school, but the others were more his newer friends from work and climbing gyms and whatever else people with functioning social lives do. I almost backed out because I had been dealing with this lingering chest cold for 2 weeks and still had that raw, drained feeling where you don't feel sick enough to stay in bed, but you also don't feel fully steady. Even packing made me tired. But that was part of why I went. I had this idea that if I got out into the woods for a couple days, got some sun, sat by a fire, maybe I'd reset myself. The place Tyler booked was more like a primitive campground on the edge of state land than a real, maintained site. There were maybe 6 designated spots spread far apart, a gravel access road, and a hand-painted sign warning about fast water because spring runoff had made the creeks higher than usual. That part matters. Everything was wet from recent rain, and you could hear moving water almost constantly, even when you couldn't see it. Not loud river noise, just that steady rush in the background under everything else, mixed with wind in the new leaves. We got there in the afternoon. The woods looked almost too bright, that fresh green spring color where everything seems recently unwrapped. The ground was soft. The air smelled like wet dirt and pine needles. And every few minutes you'd hear a branch dripping somewhere overhead. Our site itself was decent, a little raised area with a fire ring and enough flat ground for the tents. There was another site, maybe a quarter-mile away through the trees, but it didn't look occupied when we came in. I remember feeling kind of self-conscious right away because I was the least useful person there. Everyone else was unloading coolers, setting up tents, splitting firewood, and I was trying not to cough every time I bent over. Marin actually noticed and asked if I was okay. I told her I was fine, just still getting over something. She offered me tea from a thermos, and I sat on one of the folded camp chairs while the others got everything going. I felt older than 27 in that moment, tired in a way that was more mental than physical. I almost wish I'd left then, but there wasn't any reason to. The first few hours were completely normal. We made food, drank a little, talked about work and old stories, and the kind of things people say around a fire when they're trying to relax on purpose. As it got darker, the sounds around us changed. Birds dropped off, insects came in, and the water stood out more. Not close, exactly, but nearby enough to always be there. Tyler said there was a narrow stream down a slope behind the site, maybe a 5-minute walk. Marin said she'd seen it while they were gathering kindling, and that it was pretty. That was it, just a stream. The first weird thing was small enough that I didn't really mention it. While everyone was talking, I kept thinking I could hear somebody farther off in the trees. Not talking, more like humming. I would notice it for 2 or 3 seconds at a time, then lose it under the fire crackling or somebody laughing. I told myself it was probably water moving over rocks in a certain rhythm, or somebody at the other campsite. Sound carries oddly in the woods at night, especially with damp air. Later, when we were all turning in, I heard it more clearly. I was inside my tent, half asleep, listening to the zipper of Tyler and Marin's tent, somebody shifting an air mattress, somebody else walking off to pee. Then, in between all that, I heard what sounded like a woman singing very softly, no words I could make out, just a tune, rising and falling. It seemed far enough away that I wasn't alarmed, but close enough to be strange. I unzipped my tent a little and listened. The night was cold enough that I could see a little of my own breath in the flashlight beam. I could hear the stream, the wind moving the tarp lines, and then that voice again. I almost called out to ask if anyone else heard it, but I didn't want to be the paranoid sick guy hearing things in the woods. I convinced myself somebody from another campsite was messing around, maybe a little drunk. Eventually I fell asleep. The next morning I brought it up casually while we were making coffee. Tyler said he'd heard something too, but thought it was birds. Marin said she'd woken up once and assumed someone had music playing in a car down the access road. The other couple, Nina and Eric, didn't hear anything. We joked about forest sirens and moved on. If it had stopped there, it would have become one of those camp stories where everybody remembers it slightly differently and nobody cares. The day was mostly hiking. I was lagging behind because my energy still wasn't back, so I spent more time than the others noticing small stuff. Fresh mud, washed out trail edges. The smell of cold water whenever we crossed low ground. At one point, we came to a narrower path that sloped down toward the stream behind our site, and Eric wanted to check it out because he was looking for a place to filter water later. We all went. The stream was beautiful in an annoying postcard way. Clear water over flat dark stones, moss all along the banks, sunlight cutting through the trees and hitting the surface so it flashed silver. The thing I remember most is how isolated it felt compared to the rest of the woods. Like the sound of the water swallowed everything nearby. We stood there for a minute, just looking at it. Tyler skipped a stick through it. Marin took pictures. I crouched down and put my hand in. It was freezing. There was also something else there I noticed before anyone mentioned it. An old folding camp chair on the opposite bank, half sunk in mud. One of those cheap aluminum ones with fabric stretched across the frame. It looked weathered, but not ancient. Eric said maybe someone had tried to fish there and left it. Nina pointed out there wasn't really enough room to fish comfortably. We laughed about lazy campers and headed back up. That evening, the air got colder fast. We ate early and stayed near the fire. Nobody drank much because we were all a little tired. Around maybe 10, Eric realized he had left his water filter and a small dry bag somewhere near the stream. He was annoyed at himself and said he'd run down and grab it before sleeping. Tyler stood up and said he'd go with him, but Eric waved him off. He had a headlamp, and it was a short walk. This is where the whole thing still bothers me, because none of it was dramatic at first. Like, we just kept sitting there. Marin was poking at the fire. Nina was wrapped in a blanket. I was listening to the woods and trying not to cough. Then after a few minutes, I heard the singing again, much clearer than the night before. It was coming from downhill, not loud, not theatrical, just close enough that it stood apart from the water. It sounded like somebody singing to themselves, almost under their breath. Nina looked up first and said, "Okay, that's weird." Marin turned toward the path and called Eric's name. No answer. Tyler stood up right away. He shouted again, louder this time. Still nothing. We could hear the stream, and that low singing, and then what sounded like a shoe sliding on wet ground. Tyler grabbed a flashlight and started down the path. I followed because it felt wrong to stay behind, though honestly, I was already winded from the incline before we got halfway. The beam from Tyler's flashlight bounced all over the trees. The path was muddy and narrower than I remembered. We kept calling Eric's name, and the only response was the water. Then the singing stopped, just cut off. That was the moment when the whole thing changed for me. Not because it was scary in some movie way, but because it felt like whoever had been making that sound knew we were coming. When we reached the stream, Tyler's light landed on Eric immediately. He was down on one knee at the edge of the bank, leaning forward in a way that at first looked like he was washing his hands. Then he shifted, and I saw that one of his shoes was already in the water, and the mud under him had collapsed. He wasn't responding to us. He was staring straight ahead across the stream. I remember every detail of that second, because it's the one image I still get stuck on sometimes. His face looked blank, completely blank, and his head was tilted slightly, like he was listening to someone standing right in front of him. A woman was on the opposite bank, maybe 20 feet away, partially behind a tree. I could see her because Tyler's light hit her legs first. She was barefoot in the mud, wearing what looked like a pale sweatshirt or long shirt that hung almost to her knees, soaked dark at the bottom. One hand was on the tree trunk. She didn't look ghostly or anything like that. She looked real, which was worse, thin, dirty, and still. Tyler yelled, and the light jumped up to her face. She moved immediately, not toward us, but backward into the trees. Fast. Way faster than I expected on that terrain. At the same moment, Eric leaned farther forward, like he was about to step fully into the stream, and Tyler lunged and grabbed the back of his jacket. They both slid. I got there just in time to grab Tyler's arm because the bank was basically liquefied from runoff. The mud gave under all of us. Cold water splashed up my legs, and Eric started fighting in this confused, panicked way, not like he was attacked, more like he'd been jerked awake in the middle of doing something and didn't understand why we were pulling him. He kept saying, "Wait, wait, wait," like we were interrupting him. Then he looked around and started swearing. His dry bag was in the water, drifting against some branches downstream. I asked him who the woman was, and he just stared at me. Tyler swung the flashlight around the opposite bank, but there was nothing there anymore except trees and the old chair. I hadn't noticed it in the dark until then, but it was positioned facing the stream, not collapsed randomly like we'd thought earlier, just sitting there. We got Eric back to camp soaked and shaking. He said he'd heard someone singing and thought maybe somebody needed help. When he got down there, he saw a woman across the stream. He said she looked young, maybe early 20s, and she smiled at him like she recognized him. He knew that made no sense, but in the moment he had this strong feeling that if he just got closer, she'd explain something. That's exactly how he described it. He kept saying he knew how stupid it sounded. None of us slept much. Tyler wanted to call a ranger immediately, but service was weak and spotty. When he finally got enough signal to connect to the campground contact number, no one answered because it was after hours. We argued about whether to leave in the middle of the night. In the end, we waited until first light, because packing in the dark on muddy ground felt like another good way to get hurt. Morning made everything look flatter and more embarrassing, like maybe we'd all overreacted. But when Tyler and I went back down to the stream to look one more time before leaving, there were bare footprints in the mud on the opposite bank. Small ones, not fresh enough to be glossy, but clear. There was also a crushed plastic grocery bag caught in brush, and a patch farther back where it looked like someone had been sleeping under a blue tarp recently, though the tarp itself was gone. We didn't cross over. We didn't call out. We just went back. On the drive out, we stopped at the ranger station near the park entrance and told the woman at the desk what happened. She listened without looking surprised, which I didn't like. She asked where exactly the stream was and whether we saw signs of a transient camp. Tyler said yes. She nodded and wrote something down. Then she gave us the kind of careful answer people use when they don't want to say too much. She said people sometimes use undeveloped areas off the state land for temporary shelter, and visitors should never approach anyone alone, especially near water in spring, because banks collapse and current is stronger than it looks. That was probably the whole explanation. A person living out there may be mentally unwell, maybe intentionally trying to lure people closer for reasons I don't want to guess at. It fits, it makes sense. But what I still think about is how ordinary the singing sounded and how quickly Eric seemed to stop acting like himself when he heard it up close. He is not an impulsive person. He works in IT, plans everything, triple checks routes, reads warning labels, and yet he was one slippery step away from going face first into freezing runoff at night because a stranger stood across the water and sang to him. We don't camp together anymore, not because of some dramatic fallout. It just quietly ended after that. Eric got very weird whenever anyone brought it up, then eventually refused to discuss it at all. Tyler switched to cabins only. I still go outside, but I don't do remote sights, and I don't like hearing water when I sleep. What gets under my skin is that there was almost certainly a real person down there, and she was probably still there after we drove away. Maybe she moved on. Maybe that was her regular spot every spring when more people came through. I don't know. I just know that sometimes, if I wake up to rain running through a gutter or a ditch outside, there's a split second where it sounds like humming, and my whole body locks up before I can remind myself where I am. The year I helped with our town's spring festival, I was 31 when I moved back to my hometown for what was supposed to be 6 months. That turned into almost 2 years. My mom had surgery on her shoulder. My lease in the city was up, and I was between jobs in a way that sounded temporary when I said it out loud, but felt a lot worse in private. I had been doing event planning for a hotel group, got laid off after a restructuring, and suddenly I was back in the same small town in southern Indiana where I spent high school trying to leave. Spring is a big deal there, bigger than it should be for a place with one stoplight and a downtown you can cross in a minute. The town's whole identity is this annual spring bloom festival. People plant flower beds around the square. Churches compete over displays. There are little walking tours, food stands, local bands, all of that. It sounds harmless because mostly it is. It's the kind of thing retirees love, kids tolerate, and people my age usually leave behind. Because of my work background, I got pulled into helping almost immediately. My mom volunteered me before her stitches were even out. The Chamber of Commerce needed someone who knew schedules and signage and vendor maps, and I was home and unemployed, so there wasn't much of an excuse. Nay, part of me was grateful, honestly. It gave me structure. I'd wake up, drive my mom to physical therapy, or help her get dressed if she was having a bad morning, then head into town and spend a few hours with people who were busy enough not to ask too many personal questions. I was also not in a great place mentally then. Nothing dramatic, Just that low-grade failure feeling where every conversation seems to circle back to what you're doing next. I wasn't sleeping well. I had gained weight that winter. My skin was breaking out from stress, and I kept getting these tension headaches right behind my eyes. So if some details from that spring sound sharper than others, that's probably why. I was tired all the time, but I noticed things. The festival committee was mostly women in their 50s and 60s who knew absolutely everything happening in town before it happened. The unofficial leader was Denise, who ran a florist shop and had the kind of energy that made everyone else move faster. She put me in charge of volunteer check-ins, supply lists, and coordinating where the planting teams would work around the square and along the main road. Most of the flowers came from a regional greenhouse we'd used for years. Flats of marigolds, petunias, salvia, impatiens, things like that. Nothing unusual. The first odd thing wasn't even about the flowers themselves. It was that some beds looked disturbed before planting started. Freshly turned over in patches, like somebody had dug there and smoothed it back badly. We all assumed it was dogs or kids messing around. There were paw prints in a couple places, and one of the older volunteers complained that raccoons had gotten bold. We cleaned it up and planned it anyway. For the first 2 weeks, everything was normal enough. The town looked better. People were outside again. Lawnmowers, kids on bikes, screen doors slamming, the smell of mulch and cut grass everywhere. I spent most mornings unloading supplies and most evenings helping my mom or sitting on the porch with her while she gave me updates on people I hadn't thought about in 10 years. It was boring in a way I had actually started to appreciate. Then we started having little problems around the square. Decorative plant markers kept going missing. A few flower beds looked tamped down overnight, as if someone had knelt in them. Denise blamed teenagers. The police chief, who was basically semi-retired and impossible to alarm, said he could do an extra drive-through after dark. We all rolled our eyes and carried on. What made me pay attention was a smell. Not strong, not constant, but every now and then when I'd be crouched near one of the larger town beds, especially the ones closest to the old gazebo, I'd catch this sour organic smell under the fertilizer and damp soil. Not exactly dead animal bad, more like something moldy and trapped underground. I mentioned it once, and another volunteer told me spring always smells weird when the ground thaws, which is true. So I let it go. About a week before the festival, I started opening the supply shed in the mornings because Denise had early deliveries. The shed sat behind the community hall, and from there you could see most of the square if the trees weren't too full. One morning, a little after 6, I unlocked it and noticed a man standing near one of the big flower beds by the war memorial. He had on a tan work jacket and was bent over like he was checking irrigation or pulling weeds. That didn't seem strange at first because we had town maintenance crews in and out all the time. I actually waved. He didn't wave back. He just straightened up and walked behind the hedge line toward the alley beside the bank. Not fast, not sneaky, just gone by the time I came back out carrying flats. I asked Denise later if she'd sent somebody from Public Works to check the beds. She said no. I described him as best I could, but it wasn't much. Middle-aged maybe, average height, cap on, work clothes. In a town that size, that description fit half the men over 40. That same afternoon, while we were setting up tables, one of the girls from the high school volunteer group came over looking pale and said she'd found a shoe in the west bed near the fountain. Just one shoe, dirty and partly buried. Denise got annoyed because she thought it was a prank and told me to throw it out. It was an old women's flat, faded blue, cheap looking. I remember tapping the dirt out of it against the dumpster and feeling embarrassed by how unsettled it made me. It was just a shoe. The next day, there was another one. Not a match. A different shoe entirely. This one, a man's canvas slip-on, buried at the edge of a flower bed near the church booth area. At that point, even Denise stopped acting like it was funny. The police chief came out, looked around, poked the dirt with the toe of his boot, and said people dump weird stuff all the time. He took the shoes anyway. I wish I could say that was when everyone got serious, but small-town logic is strange. If there isn't a clean emergency, people work around discomfort. The festival was too close, vendors were already arriving, and nobody wanted to be the one who shut down the biggest event of the season because of 2 dirty shoes in the dirt. The real turning point happened the night before opening day. I was at the square later than most people because Denise had asked me to finish tagging booth spaces with chalk and zip tie a few signs before rain came in. My mom was at home, already irritated that I was out after dark. And I remember rushing because the wind had picked up and I could hear a storm way off. That low spring thunder that seems to drag across the sky forever before it gets to you. By then, most of downtown was empty. A couple restaurant workers were locking up. Somebody's truck passed on Main. Then it got quiet in that particular way small towns do, where every sound becomes separate. Flag ropes clinking on poles, leaves moving, a loose piece of plastic tapping somewhere. I was near the gazebo, carrying a box of flyers, when I heard a dull thump from one of the larger flower beds behind me. Not a dramatic noise, more like somebody stepping wrong in wet soil. I turned around, and at first I didn't see anything. Then I noticed the dark shape of a person crouched low in the bed nearest the memorial, almost hidden by the fresh plantings. I assumed it was a teenager messing things up, and I actually said, "Hey," in this irritated, tired voice. The person didn't answer. They were facing down, shoulders moving like they were digging with both hands. I set the box down and walked closer, maybe 10 feet away before I realized the person was an adult man. Same tan jacket as before, same cap. He was using a small hand trowel and his bare left hand to dig into the bed between the flowers. There was already a shallow hole open. Beside him on the dirt was a plastic grocery bag and what looked like pieces of clothing, muddy and folded. I asked what he was doing, louder this time, and he looked up at me. That was the one moment from that spring that I can still picture exactly. His face wasn't wild or theatrical. It was calm, almost annoyed to be interrupted. But there was dirt smeared all across his mouth and chin, like he'd wiped his face with filthy hands, and one of the flowers near his knee had something caught around the stem that took me a second to understand was a thin gold chain. I backed up immediately. He stood up too, not all the way straight at first because he'd been crouching. He said, very casually, "Town keeps planning over my things," just like that. Normal tone, like we were discussing parking. I didn't say anything smart. I grabbed the box I'd set down because panic makes people do stupidly practical things, then dropped it again and started backing toward the street. He took 2 steps forward out of the flower bed. I remember hearing the wet soil pull at his boots. I yelled then, not words really, just loud enough that one of the restaurant workers across the square looked over. As soon as he realized someone else had heard me, he turned and went behind the hedge toward the alley, the same direction as before. I didn't chase him. I didn't go near the bed. I stood in the middle of the square, shaking so hard I could hear my keys rattling in my own hand. The police actually came fast that time. because the restaurant worker called too. I told them what I saw, and at first I felt stupid repeating it because saying there was a man digging in the flower bed sounds ridiculous. Then they opened the hole he'd started and found more than clothing. Not a body, nothing like that, but enough personal items buried in layers that nobody could keep pretending it was random. Jewelry, children's hair bows, wallets with the contents removed, small pieces of clothing, and other things I never got a full list of because nobody was telling volunteers much after that. The festival opening was delayed the next morning with some vague announcement about a maintenance issue in the square. By afternoon, there were police vehicles, county investigators, and yellow tape around 3 of the central beds. Denise cried in the florist shop because she said she'd been kneeling over those beds for days. My mom told me to stop helping and stay home. I did for exactly 1 day, then spent the rest of the week half glued to the porch, half making excuses to drive through downtown. The man wasn't a drifter or some stranger passing through. That part came out quickly through town talk, even if no one said it publicly. He was local, worked seasonal landscaping and odd jobs, had access to tools, knew which areas would be replanted and mulched over every year, knew when people were around and when they weren't. From what I pieced together, he had been burying stolen personal items in public beds for years, maybe trophies, maybe just things he took after breaking into cars, sheds, and eventually homes. There were also rumors he watched women during setup days and liked being close while everyone assumed he belonged there. I don't know which parts were true. What I do know is that after I saw him, I started replaying every ordinary moment from that spring, every early morning at the shed, every time I worked alone near the square, every time I noticed disturbed soil and brushed it off. I kept thinking about how easy it was for someone to stand in plain sight if they dressed like they had a reason to be there. I left town again that summer when I found a job in Louisville. My mom was healed enough by then, and I needed to go. The festival still happens. They changed some landscaping and added more lighting around the square. But if you look at photos online, it still appears exactly the way people want it to appear. Cheerful, floral, harmless. I haven't gone back during spring. The worst part isn't even what they found. It's that I can still smell those beds if I think about them too long. Wet mulch, fertilizer, and that sour note underneath. And every time I see a town beautification post online with volunteers smiling beside fresh flowers, I think about how many people must have walked past that man over the years and felt nothing except maybe a vague sense that something looked a little off.